The chamber was enormous. It had been carved out of a hollowed asteroid centuries ago, smoothed and shaped until its walls curved like the inside of a great shell. The ceiling rose high above the floor, dark and arched, lit only by long strips of cold blue light that ran along the walls and hummed at a frequency just below what human ears could hear. The floor was pale stone, worn smooth by decades of feet and other things that were not feet crossing it. Around the center of the floor, in tiered rows that climbed toward the ceiling like the inside of a theater, sat the representatives of 47 species. Some were tall and thin. Some were wide and low to the ground. Some had more eyes than a person could comfortably look at. Some had no eyes at all. But in that moment, whatever they used for seeing was pointed at the same place. The human standing alone in the center of the floor. Ambassador Junho was not a large man. He was in his late 50s, with gray at the sides of his hair and lines around his eyes that had come from years of long nights and longer arguments in rooms exactly like this one. He wore a plain dark coat with no medals or rank markers. He had chosen that deliberately. He had known, months before this day, what this chamber was going to decide, and he had decided that medals would not change it, and he had no interest in dressing for people who had already made up their minds. The High Arbiter stood at the elevated head of the chamber. It was tall, several heads taller than Junho, and its species had never agreed on a common name in any human language. It read from a long document in the Accord's primary tongue, and the translation came through the room's speaker system in a flat, careful voice that sounded like no one in particular. The charge was straightforward. Humanity, the voice said, was too unpredictable, too individualistic. Too unwilling to move at the pace the Accord required. Humanity asked too many questions and answered too few of the ones asked back. Humanity built things without permission and explored places without clearance and made decisions without waiting for consensus. The Accord had tolerated this for 60 years of membership and had hoped humanity would grow into the structure. It had not. The decision had been made. The vote was 44-3. Humanity was to be stripped of all standing in the Galactic Accord, all trade routes, all communication relays, all shared territories, all protections, 6 standard months to withdraw from Accord-adjacent space. After that, they were on their own. Junho had already known the vote count. He had known it for 2 weeks. One of the 3 species that voted against had quietly passed the numbers to a human contact out of what seemed like guilt or maybe pity. Junho had received the message. He read it twice, set it aside, and continued packing his personal items from the embassy office. He stood still while the Arbiter finished reading. The chamber was quiet in the way that large spaces get quiet when everyone in them is holding their breath. 47 species, thousands of individuals in the gallery above, and billions more watching through live feeds on planets and stations across the galaxy. They were all waiting. They expected him to speak. That was what species did in this moment. They argued, they made promises, they begged for reconsideration, or they threatened consequences. Junho had watched it happen to others in this room before. He had helped draft the arguments for smaller species facing lesser charges. He knew the format. He let the silence go on long enough that people started shifting in their seats. Then his mouth moved, just one corner of it, lifting slightly in an expression that was not quite a smile. It was something quieter than that, the expression of a man who had been right about something for a long time and was now watching that thing happen exactly as he had predicted. Not happy, not angry, simply certain. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Every security officer in the room stepped forward slightly. He produced a small, cream-colored envelope, sealed at the back with plain wax. He walked to the podium at a calm, unhurried pace and set the envelope down on its surface. The front was addressed in the Accord's common script. It read, "To the Galactic Accord, open only when you wish to speak to humanity again." He stepped back from the podium. He looked at the High Arbiter for one long moment, calm and direct. Then he bowed. It was not the bow of someone accepting defeat. It was the bow of someone who had attended a meeting, finished their business, and was now ready to leave. He turned and walked toward the exit at the far end of the chamber. His boots made a clean, steady sound on the pale stone. He did not rush. He did not look back once. The great doors opened ahead of him, and he walked through, and they closed behind him with a sound that rolled through the chamber and then faded into silence. No one spoke for several seconds. In the press gallery above the main floor, journalist Bomi had her recorder running. She had been embedded with Accord Media for 3 years. She had expected raised voices, a long argument. It was something historic, but messy. What she had recorded instead was something she did not have a word for. She transmitted the footage immediately, without editing, without a headline. All of it. The charges, the vote count, the silence, the envelope, the walk, the door. By the time Junho's transport cleared the docking bay, the footage had reached 1,000 relay points. By the time he entered transit toward Earth, 40 billion people across the galaxy had watched it. The image that spread fastest was not the vote count. It was a single still frame. The moment Junho's mouth had moved, quiet and sure, right before he set the envelope down. On Earth, Director Taiho watched the footage with 12 people in a small room. When it ended, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Taiho stood, straightened his jacket, and walked down the hall to a broadcast terminal. He sat in front of the camera, waited for the light to go green, and spoke. He did not shout. He used no complicated words. He spoke the way a person speaks when they have been planning for a moment like this for a long time, and when they are completely sure of what they are doing. He said the Accord had voted to exile humanity. He said humanity accepted. He said all external channels were closing, effective immediately. He said there was work to do. The broadcast ended. Across Earth and its 17 colony worlds, people heard those words. They did not hear an ending. They heard something else entirely. The particular feeling of a door closing behind you when you are the one who chose to walk through it. They got to work. The galaxy noticed the silence slowly, the way you only notice a sound after it has already stopped. For the first few months after the exile vote, the mood across Accord space was something close to relief. The Vreth Dominion, which had written the original proposal to remove humanity, held public celebrations on its capital world. The Kashari Collective broadcast long statements about the dawn of a new era of galactic unity, one no longer complicated by humanity's restless and disruptive presence. Smaller species that had quietly resented humanity's speed and confidence said nothing publicly. But the general feeling in Accord political circles was that things would be simpler now, cleaner, easier to manage. They were wrong, but it took a while for wrong to become obvious. The first signs were small. A shipping corridor in the outer sectors began running behind schedule. Accord logistics teams were sent to investigate and found nothing broken, no damaged equipment, no system failure, no emergency, just absence. The humans who had managed the corridor's timing systems had not been replaced. Their Accord-assigned counterparts had assumed the systems were fully automatic. They were not. They had required daily adjustment. A fact that had never been written into any official documentation because the human workers had simply done it every day without being asked and without expecting to be thanked. A medical supply chain in the Kashari outer colonies fell 2 weeks behind. Then a month. The distribution network had been designed by a human logistics firm during humanity's first decade in the Accord and had been running so smoothly for so long that no one in the Kashari system had thought to learn how it worked. They found the original design documents and tried to read them. The documents were dense and technical and written in a way that assumed the reader already understood most of what they were reading. The Kashari engineers were not unintelligent. They were simply not trained for this. It took them 4 months to restore partial function. 2 outer stations went dark in the meantime. This was happening everywhere, at different speeds and in different forms, but always following the same pattern. A system that had worked without visible effort for years revealed itself, in the absence of the people who had maintained it, to have required constant, invisible effort. The Accord had confused quiet competence with simplicity. It had looked at systems that ran well and assumed they ran themselves. Humanity had not sabotaged anything. That was what made it so difficult to argue with. Rena, who now ran Earth's Department of Independent Infrastructure, had organized the withdrawal with precise and patient care. She had called it Operation Clean Slate, and she had planned it quietly for over a year before the vote, because she had known, as Junho had known, and as Taiho had known, that the vote was coming. Every human technician, engineer, contractor, and advisor working within Accord-connected systems had been contacted in the weeks after the announcement, briefed, and withdrawn. Not a single system was damaged. Not a single file was deleted. Everything was left exactly as it was. They just left. And the Accord discovered, one collapsing system at a time, that there is a significant difference between a machine working and a machine being maintained. Physicist Una did not celebrate. She was too busy. Working from a secure facility on one of Earth's outer colony stations, she had been developing something she called the isolation drive for years. Not a weapon, not a ship engine, but a network. A shielding system that used a method of quantum tunnel interference to scatter the sensor signatures of entire star systems, rendering them invisible to conventional detection. It was the most complex thing she had ever built. It worked on the first full test, which surprised even her. Within 8 months of the exile, Earth's solar system and all 17 colony worlds vanished from every Accord map simultaneously. Not destroyed, not moved, simply gone. And as though someone had quietly lifted the ink from the page. The Accord sent search ships. They found empty space. They checked their instruments. Their instruments were fine. They searched again and found nothing. They debated in closed sessions whether humanity had somehow destroyed itself in some extreme act of final defiance. Some of the Vreth representatives seemed almost to hope that was the answer, because it would mean no other explanation was needed. But humanity had not destroyed itself. It was simply invisible, working quietly behind a wall of physics that the Accord did not yet understand and would not understand for a long time. Intelligence Officer Seho monitored all of this from a cloaked observation station he had positioned at the edge of Accord space before the isolation drive activated. He was part of a small, deliberately unrecorded team, 12 people with long-range passive sensors, no active signals, and clear instructions not to interfere with anything they observed. They watched. They recorded. They reported. Seho sent dispatches back through a tight beam relay system that Una had designed specifically for this purpose, a channel so narrow and precisely aimed that the Accord's sensor networks registered it as background noise, if they registered it at all. His reports were factual and dry. He documented the failed supply chains and the collapsed distribution networks. He noted which species were trying to solve the problems themselves, and which were looking for someone to blame. He tracked the internal arguments growing louder inside the Vreth Dominion, and the increasingly strained broadcasts coming from the Kashari Collective. Each report ended with the same sentence. They are starting to understand. The species that had voted against the exile, primarily the Thenu and the Oravasi, suffered alongside the others but responded differently. The Thenu, a methodical and careful people, began working on the broken systems themselves, learning as they went, getting things wrong first and then getting them right. They did not ask the Accord for help. They did not publicly blame anyone. They simply worked. Seho noted in his reports that of all the species in the Accord, the Thenu were the only ones who responded to the crisis by trying to understand it, rather than find someone to blame for it. He made sure Director Taiho read those sections carefully each week. By the 5th year, the Kashari Collective had lost 2 outer colonies entirely, not to war or disaster, but to the slow and ordinary collapse of logistic systems that no one had maintained. The Vreth Dominion was turning inward, its leaders arguing about responsibility in terms that were growing louder and less diplomatic. They blamed each other. They blamed the species that had voted against exile for not warning them more clearly. They blamed the equipment. In every official capacity, they did not say the word human, because saying that word would mean admitting something they were not yet willing to admit. Seho watched their broadcasts on a small screen in the observation station, a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside him. He wrote in his private notes what he could not put in the official reports. They thought removing us would make things simpler. What they learned is that things were only simple because we were quietly making them that way. They mistook our helpfulness for smallness. They always do. He sent the official report. He drank the cold coffee. Outside the station's porthole, the stars of Accord space looked exactly the same as they always had, distant, quiet, and completely unaware that the people who had been keeping the lights on were gone. Behind the wall that Una had built, the world was very quiet, in a way that felt, at first, like holding your breath. The first months were the hardest, not because humanity was struggling. Earth and its colonies had been made self-sufficient by quiet design, a fact that Tieho's government had been carefully ensuring for 15 years before anyone used the word exile in an official chamber. Food production was steady, energy was stable, trade between the 17 colony worlds moved without interruption. The hard part was something else entirely. It was the feeling of a door being closed and the question sitting in the quiet behind it. What do you do next when the room you are standing in is the only room you have? Tieho's answer to that question was not a speech. It was a document, long, detailed, and very dry. It outlined priorities for the coming decade in the plain language of policy. It said essentially that humanity was now operating without external input for the first time in 60 years, and that this was not a disaster, but a condition, and that the correct response to a condition was not grief, but work. Admiral Sora reorganized the defense fleet within the first year. There was nothing left to defend against. The Accord had no intention of attacking, and no other species had the reach. The fleet was large, well-crewed, and suddenly without a clear purpose. Sora gave it one. She redesignated the majority of the fleet as an exploration force, stripped out weapon systems where they were not essential, added long-range sensor equipment and research labs, and pointed the ships in the only direction that remained open, away from Accord space, into the unexplored dark that the Accord had always listed on its charts as empty. Commander Daiho was given the lead vessel of the new exploration arm. It had been a defense cruiser 6 months before. It had been refitted in a time frame that most of the engineering teams considered physically impossible. He named it Closed Door. The name was approved without discussion. The region the Accord had designated as the Vereth Expanse appeared in every shared database as a stretch of confirmed empty space. It was surveyed and recorded as barren across 3 separate Accord expeditions over the previous century. The databases were detailed. The details were false. Daiho found the first indication within 8 months. Energy readings, faint and slightly too regular to be natural, coming from deep inside the expanse. He took the closed door in carefully, running passive sensors, cataloging everything. And what he found over the following months was something so far from what the databases had said that when his report finally reached Taiho and Sora, everyone in the room read it in complete silence. 3 planets, 2 with breathable atmospheres and established biospheres, 1 with complex organisms that were not intelligent by any measurement humans used, but were clearly abundantly alive in ways that kept the biologists on Daiho's crew from sleeping properly because they were too full of excitement to be still. And surrounding all 3 worlds, a wide asteroid belt dense with materials that the Accord's shared scientific documents had stated clearly, repeatedly, and with apparent confidence did not exist in harvestable quantities anywhere within 2,000 light-years of Accord space. They had lied. The Accord had surveyed this region, found it rich, and buried the findings. They had kept it off the shared maps. They had maintained the fiction of scarcity to hold control over trade and dependency, to keep every member species needing something that only the Accord's established powers could provide. Humanity, as a member, had built its resource policy on information that had been deliberately falsified for decades. Daiho sat in his captain's chair for a long time after his team had confirmed and reconfirmed the findings. Then he sent the report home and added 1 line at the bottom in plain text, outside the formal structure of the document. We were lied to. The room is larger than they told us. We are going in. Back on Earth, xenolinguist Minji had turned her talents inward with the same intensity she had once used to speak across species. Her career had been built on building bridges between human language and the communication systems of other civilizations. Now she turned that skill on something older. A series of deep space signals that the Accord's outer sensor arrays had been quietly filtering out for decades, classifying them automatically as background interference. With the isolation drive active and humanity's own networks no longer bound by Accord protocols, those signals were visible for the first time. They were not random. They were structured. They were very, very old. It took Minji 6 years, working with 12 linguists and 4 mathematicians, to decode them fully. What they found was not a message addressed to humanity. It was more like a record a communications archive left by a civilization that had existed before the current Accord, one of several such civilizations the galaxy had hosted over its long history and lost. The archive described in careful detail how each previous galactic coalition had formed, expanded, and eventually failed. Every single one had failed the same way. They had identified the species among them that were most productive, most innovative, most disruptive to comfortable consensus, and they had voted to remove them. Every time, without exception, the coalition had collapsed from the inside within a few decades. Minji read the final entry of the archive in the translated form her team had prepared, and she sat quietly for a long time before she sent it to Taiho. It said, in its plain conclusion, "We made the same mistake. We believed the most difficult ones were the problem. They were the reason we were still standing." Meanwhile, freed from the quiet research restrictions that Accord membership had always enforced through slow bureaucratic agreement, restrictions that were never written as laws but had always functioned as them, human science moved fast. New propulsion systems appeared in engineering labs that had spent years waiting for approval that never came. Medical advances that the Accord's pharmaceutical frameworks would have delayed by a decade reached patients in months. Engineering solutions that standardization committees would have argued over for years were tested, refined, and deployed. Humanity built. It colonized all three worlds in the Varaith expanse. It established permanent stations throughout the asteroid belt. It named everything it touched. Its population grew. Its territory expanded beyond anything it had ever held during its years in the Accord. Its ships were faster. Its cities were cleaner. Its people were, by every measure that meant anything, doing well. By the year 2390, 50 years after the door closed, Taiho was elderly and weeks from retirement. He gave one final broadcast. He sat in the same chair he had used the night the door closed, in the same room. And he said what he had been waiting 50 years to say. He said humanity had not needed the Accord. He said, more carefully, that it never had. He said the only thing the exile had truly taken from them was the comfortable illusion that they did. Then he signed his final papers, stood up slowly, and went home. The stars of the Varaith expanse were visible from the colony he retired to. 3 of them had planets beneath them now, cities, fields, children running through streets that had been built by people who had come through a closed door and found on the other side of it more than anyone had told them was there. He sat on his porch in the evening and watched those stars and did not say anything about them to anyone because there was nothing left to say. The work had already spoken. The Galactic Accord did not fall apart all at once. That would have been too clean, too easy to point to. It came apart the way a wall comes apart when the mortar between the stones is slowly removed. The stones hold their place for a long time, and then one day you lean against the wall and realize it is no longer a wall. It is just a row of stones waiting to fall. The Vreth Dominion went first among the great powers. In the years immediately following the exile, they had expanded into the trade corridors and logistical territories that humanity had managed, moving fast while the other species were still trying to understand why their supply systems were failing. It looked, for a few years, like success. The Vreth were larger now, more space, more declared territory, more political weight in what remained of Accord governance. But territory is not the same as capability, and expansion is not the same as strength. By the 3rd decade after the exile, the Dominion's outer systems were in open conflict with each other over resource distribution. The central government, which had always ruled through projection rather than genuine administration, found that it had spread itself across more space than it could actually manage. It could project nothing anymore. It could barely hold its own core worlds in agreement. The Kashari Collective held together longer, but at a cost that showed on everything it did. They had lost outer colonies to slow logistical failure in the first decade of humanity's absence. They had lost more in the second. Their inner worlds remained stable, but their influence in what remained of Accord politics had shrunk to a fraction of what it had been when they led the exile vote. The species that had followed their lead and voted alongside them felt, if not quite betrayed, then deeply and permanently unimpressed. The Kashari made no public statements about humanity. They did not need to. The silence was loud enough on its own. Intelligence Officer Seiho was now in his early 60s, and the small observation station he had crewed alone with 11 others had grown into a permanent facility of 40 analysts, linguists, and sensor operators. They maintained a real-time picture of Accord space that was, in several important respects, more accurate and more current than anything the Accord's own intelligence services could produce. Seiho briefed the new Council of the Human Sovereign Compact every 2 weeks, presenting data without commentary and letting the numbers speak. The compact was different from the old Earth government. It had been built by people who had grown up after the exile, people for whom the Accord was not a memory of belonging, but simply a political structure that existed on the other side of a wall they had never personally touched. They were not angry at the Accord. They were not nostalgic for it. They assessed it the way a competent person assesses anything, by what it could do, what it was worth, and what it was likely to do next. The first formal contact request from the Accord arrived in 2393. It reached the automated relay station at the edge of human space, a structure Seiho's team maintained specifically for this purpose, and triggered the pre-recorded response that had been set up and waiting for years. The request was long, carefully worded, and formal. The response it received was 12 words in the Accord's common script. "The door is closed. We will open it when we decide to." Not before. 36 more requests arrived over the following 8 years, varying in tone from formal to urgent to something that read, underneath the diplomatic language, as close to desperate. 2 of the requests came specifically from the Thennu. They were shorter and more direct than the others, and worded in a way that felt less like asking and more like honest accounting, an acknowledgement that things had gone wrong and that they understood why, and that they were asking not out of entitlement, but out of genuine need. Seiho flagged those 2 in his reports to the Compact with a note explaining the Thennu's conduct since the exile, how they had worked to fix broken systems themselves, how they had not blamed anyone publicly, how they had quietly tried to become more capable rather than waiting for someone to rescue them. He made his position clear. If any species in the Accord deserved to be considered differently, it was the Thennu. All 47 requests received the same 12-word reply, but the Compact was reading them all very carefully. The debate inside the Compact about what to do ran through committees and public forums and the kind of long, honest arguments that good governments have when they are genuinely uncertain. One side argued that humanity should stay behind the isolation drive permanently. They said that re-engaging with the Accord carried risks that simply did not need to be taken, that humanity was thriving, its colonies were growing, its science was advancing, and none of that required the Accord's cooperation or acknowledgement. They said that going back was sentimental. They said the door should stay closed. The other side argued that humanity was now powerful enough that engagement carried no real danger, only opportunity, that the galaxy was large, and the new species humanity had the potential to meet beyond Accord space would eventually require frameworks and agreements, and that humanity should be the one building those frameworks rather than discovering them already built by someone else. Neither side was wrong, which was precisely what made the debate go on as long as it did. Admiral Sora was not a council member. She had never wanted to be. But she had attended enough briefings to understand what both sides were really arguing about, and she asked, at the end of one long session that had accomplished nothing, to speak. She did not take long. She said that both sides were treating re-engagement as something being done for the Accord's benefit, and that this was the wrong frame entirely. She said humanity was not going back because the Accord needed saving. She said humanity was going back because humanity had decided to, for its own reasons, and that every single condition of any re-engagement would be written by humanity and accepted in full before anyone opened anything. She said the question was not whether to go back. The question was what the room looked like when they got there and who built it. She said, if they want to be in the room, they agree to the room we build. The session went quiet in a different way after that. The kind of quiet that means something has been decided. Even before the formal vote is cast, the Sovereign Re-Engagement Accord was drafted over the following year by human legal and diplomatic teams. It was not a peace treaty because there had been no war. It was not an apology accepted because humanity had not asked for one and was not offering any. It was a restructuring, a new framework for a new galactic community, written entirely by the people the old community had voted to remove. Permanent seat. Veto power on structural decisions. The right to withdraw at any time without penalty or consequence. Equal floor space for every species in any shared chamber. And in the preamble, in plain language that no translator could soften, the acknowledgement that the previous Accord's exile vote had been wrong. Not morally wrong, though it was that too, but factually wrong, in that it had produced outcomes directly contrary to every stated goal the Accord had ever claimed to hold. It was not negotiable. The document said so on the first page. Seho transmitted it through the relay station to what remained of the Accord's functioning administration and attached a short cover note. He said the terms were final. 3 weeks later, the Accord's High Arbiter opened the small, cream-colored envelope that had been sitting in the Accord's formal archive for 60 years, sealed behind glass in the record room of the old Convocation Hall. The wax had yellowed. The card inside had not changed. It read, "When you're ready to do this properly, you know where to find us." Junho, Ambassador, retired. The Arbiter held the card for a long time, then it authorized the formal response to the Sovereign Compact. The response was 2 words: "We accept." The new chamber had no ceiling in the traditional sense, where the old Convocation Hall had been dark and vaulted and cold. This one opened upward through a dome of clear material that human engineers had developed in a research lab in the Verith colonies, stronger than anything the Accord's material science had previously produced, curved and seamless, and so clear that on a good day, you forgot it was there at all. Through it, unfiltered and unobstructed, the stars of the Verath expanse were visible. 3 of those stars had planets circling them now, planets with cities on them, with streets and schools and children who had been born under skies that no Accord survey had ever recorded, because the Accord had decided those skies did not exist. The chamber had been designed by a human architecture team, working with input from Thenu and Oravasi representatives who had been invited into the process because Seho had recommended it, and the compact had agreed. It was circular. Every seat was at the same level as every other seat. No elevated positions. No tiered galleries above the floor, no elevated platforms from which one species could look down at another. The materials had been sourced from the asteroid belt in the expanse. Human construction teams had built it in 14 months. During those 14 months, the Accord's own building committee had held 6 planning sessions and had not yet agreed on the shape of the room. Ara was 26 years old. She had been born on the second planet of the Verath expanse, a world that had no name when her parents arrived on it, and which was now called Sabyok, a word that meant the particular quality of light that appears in the sky in the minutes before the sun actually rises. She had grown up knowing that humanity had been exiled before she was born. She knew it the way children know history, as a fact that had shaped the world she lived in, real and important, but without the weight it carried for the people who had actually lived through it. She had not been in the chamber the night of the vote. She had not seen the smirk in person. She had not heard Taiho's first broadcast as it was broadcast. She had grown up in a civilization that had already found its own roads and mapped its own stars, and knew in every small and daily way that it did not need anyone's permission to exist and had not needed it for a long time. She had studied diplomacy and political structure, and she was very good at both. When the Compact's selection committee had spent 3 months reviewing candidates for humanity's first ambassador to the new assembly and had chosen her, she had accepted without ceremony and asked when she needed to be ready. She walked into the new chamber through the main entrance. The doors were wide enough for 3 species to pass through side by side. That was a deliberate choice, one of several hundred deliberate choices built into the structure of the room. Representatives of 41 species were already seated, 6 species whose governments had collapsed entirely in the years since the exile were absent. Their seats were present but empty, another deliberate choice, a visible reminder that the new assembly had committed to helping those civilizations rebuild, that absence was not the same as removal, and that the door of this room opened in both directions. The chamber was quiet when Ara walked in, not the tense, near held-breath quiet of the old Convocation Hall. Something different. The quiet of a room full of people who are paying attention because what is happening is genuinely worth paying attention to. She walked to her seat. It It was arranged as one among equals, as the design specified, but the floor of this chamber had been built by human hands, and the dome above had been engineered by human minds, and the document that governed everything happening in this room had been written by human diplomats. And as Ara sat down, there was a general and quiet understanding in the chamber that the center of the circle was, in a way that required no announcement, where she already stood. The Vreth representative was seated 2 positions to her left. It was older than most of the representatives in the room, its outer regions still slowly being reconstructed, its political influence a shadow of what it had been when the Vreth led the world in celebrating humanity's exile. It leaned toward her slightly and spoke through its translator in a low voice. It said it had not expected humanity to come back. Ara looked at it for a moment. She thought of Junho, whom she had never met, whose photograph she had seen once in a museum as a student, the still frame, the corner of the mouth, the envelope on the podium. She had stood in front of that photograph for a long time and tried to understand what the expression meant. She understood it better now. She said, "We did not come back. We arrived. There is a difference." The Vreth representative did not answer. It settled back in its seat and was quiet for a long time afterward, and the quiet told Ara what she needed to know. The first session opened with a reading of the Sovereign Re-engagement Accords Preamble, not by a High Arbiter, because this structure had no High Arbiter, but by a representative of the Thenu, selected by open vote for the honor. Their voice was steady and careful, and they read every word at the same pace, giving nothing more emphasis than anything else. When they reached the preamble section acknowledging the exile vote as factually wrong, the chamber was very still. No one spoke over it. No one moved. Everyone in the room allowed the words to exist in the air and do what they needed to do. The vote to ratify the new assembly's foundational charter was unanimous. The Vreth voted yes. The Kashari voted yes. The Thenu voted yes. And several of their representatives allowed themselves a small expression that in their species indicated something between relief and vindication. They had voted against the exile 60 years ago, and they had spent 60 years trying to manage in the world that decision had produced. And now they were sitting in a room built by the people the old world had cast out, and the room was better than the one they had lost. When the session ended, Bomi made her way down from the press area above the main floor. She was 81 years old, and she moved slowly and with care, and her hands were not as steady as they had been the night she broadcast Junho's smirk from the old chamber 60 years before. But her eye for a moment was as good as it had ever been, and she knew what she was looking for before she raised the recorder. The image she sent across the galaxy showed Ara in her seat on the chamber floor, straight-backed, composed, looking at nothing in particular, the stars of the Verith expanse visible through the clear dome above her head. Stars the old Accord had hidden from its own members. Stars humanity had found on its own. Stars that now had names given by people who had been born beneath them. She sent it without a headline. It did not need one. On Earth, in a quiet museum in a city that had been rebuilt twice in the decades since the exile, a photograph hung behind glass in a long corridor of historical records. It was the still frame, Junho, mid-smirk, in the moment before he placed the envelope on the podium. The image had been there for decades. Beside it, a small plaque had recently been added. It had been written by Taiho in the months before he died and left with his personal papers, addressed to whoever was responsible for the archive, with a note indicating when it should be displayed. The plaque read, "They voted to exile humanity." We smirked, shut the door, and never looked back. 60 years later, we built a better room and invited them in. They were grateful. We were not surprised. Ara had read it once as a student on a school visit. She had stood there for a while and thought about the last 4 words in particular. Not the smirk, not the door, not the gratefulness of the species that had cast them out. She had thought about what it meant to not be surprised. What kind of people built that into themselves so deeply that it became the ending of a sentence about 60 years of history? She understood it now in a way she had not then. She gathered her documents from the table, nodded once to the Thenu representative who had read the charter, and walked out of the chamber through the wide doors, under the dome, beneath the stars of a sky that humanity had found on its own, through a door they had built, in a room they had designed, at the center of a galaxy that was finally, slowly, and on terms that had been set without compromise, beginning to understand the people it had once tried to leave behind. It had taken 60 years. It had cost the Accord nearly everything it had, and humanity, for its part, had not been surprised at all.